Dean made pretty clear in his talk, what he's looking for, what we need today is a completely different, crazy view of reality. And I have a crazy view of reality to present to you this morning. It's a rather provocative talk about a possible explanation of all of reality. And if I'm saying something this radical, it's always good to have some backup from people that know what they're talking about. And there are two astrophysicists in the last century that I admire greatly, James Jeans and Sir Arthur Eddington, and they had this to say. Jeans wrote, "The stream of knowledge is heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. Mind no longer appears as an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather to hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter." Well, that's pretty clear that he's looking for something different than a typical mechanical explanation of reality. Sir Arthur Eddington was the one who made Einstein famous. He was the one who led the eclipse expedition in 1919 that measured the deflection of starlight that proved that Einstein was correct with respect to his theory of gravitation, the general theory of relativity. And Eddington had this to say about cognition. "I think that those who would wish to take cognition of nothing but the measurements of the scientific world made by our sense organs are shirking one of the most immediate facts of experience, namely that consciousness is not wholly nor even primarily a device for receiving sense impressions." So he too believed that consciousness was something far greater than simply an epiphenomenon of of reality. These are two books that he wrote. The one on the right, The Mathematical Theory of Relativity, is the one I used when I was in graduate school, and it was the first textbook on relativity written in the 1920s, full of tensor calculus. The other one is Science and the Unseen World, and talks about Eddington's beliefs in other reality beyond the physical. So one possible interpretation of reality is that the physical world is real and all there is. Okay, that's the typical scientific worldview that you see. What you see here is what you get. You get what you see. Another explanation is that the physical world is real, but other realities exist. Now, interestingly, this could infer both a spiritual worldview, where you have other realms of who knows what, could also refer to the modern theories of an M theory of physics, where you have other universes, other brains, other dimensions. So it could actually apply to two very different things, but it implies that there are at least two kinds of reality: the world of consciousness and some other who knows what. A third one that's being talked about more and more today is that the physical world is a technologically based simulation, and so are we. Now, in this view, the simulation is run on some kind of a supercomputer in the far future by beings, maybe not much different than you and I, but simply who have more technology available, creating the realm of their ancestors, which are us, and seeing how we would survive in a world that's created by them. In this view, unfortunately, we are nothing special. We are simply part of the calculations, part of the computations. We think we're live physical beings, but in fact we're total simulations, and we're nothing but bits and bytes in this computer. A rather depressing view of things. What I'm going to present is a view that's sort of parallel to this, but it's very optimistic. That makes us the real McCoy, and the world the virtual reality that we operate within. So if we have a virtual reality that we create nowadays, we might have something like this, where we create an avatar, and the avatar is about to go out and fight or do whatever he does along this plane, and this is the world of virtual reality that you can buy off the shelf today. We'll assume that instead of there being us creating a virtual reality, it's some great consciousness. And unfortunately, I can't picture great consciousness in any way other than this old man up here with a beard in the clouds, so don't take that too seriously. This is consciousness up there. The consciousness creates a reality and then enters into the physical reality that's been created to play the game, become the avatar. Are you living in a computer simulation? Well, this idea of the computer simulation is gaining ground, and one of the leading gentlemen in this field is Nick Bostrom at Oxford University, who published a very thought-provoking paper in the Philosophical Quarterly. And this has gotten quite a bit of attention to the idea of simulations of virtual realities that apply on the grandest scale. John Tierney, writing in the New York Times, had this to say about Bostrom. Tierney writes, "Until I talked to Nick Bostrom, a philosopher at Oxford University, it never occurred to me that our universe might be somebody else's hobby. I hadn't imagined that the omniscient, omnipotent creator of the heavens and earth could be an advanced version of a guy who spends his weekends building model railroads or overseeing video game worlds like The Sims." But it now seems quite possible. In fact, if you accept a pretty reasonable assumption of Dr. Bostrom's, it's almost a mathematical certainty that we're living in someone else's computer simulation. So what is another possibility that we ought to consider in terms of a model of reality? It's the last one, that the physical world is a consciousness-based simulation. And consciousness is all there is and includes us. So in this view, there's only one thing. There's not many different kinds of things to try to explain, like consciousness, physical realities, other realities beyond that. There's only one thing, and that's consciousness. And that's responsible for everything in terms of both creating a world that it resides in, that it lives in, it experiences, and in terms of that being all that there is. In fact, we know what it is. Consciousness is something we experience ourselves. Therefore, and we can't explain it in terms of anything other than what it is. We can't explain it in terms of anything simpler, because to do that would be to back away from the problem. So in this sense, consciousness is already resolved as something that we're trying to understand. We know what it is. We have it. It's our thoughts and our minds. Now, what kind of evidence might there be for this sort of thing? Well, let's take a measurement. This shows the reflection of a mountain in a lake, and shows that about some small percentage of the light is reflected off the surface of the lake. In fact, it's about 4%. Well, this is a diagram from the book by Feynman on QED. He talks about a light source impinging a glass surface, as the light hitting the lake would be an analogy of. And there are about 4 photons reflected off the front surface for every 100 that pass into the medium. 4 photons on an average are the ones that reflect from the surface. Well, the question is, how does every 25th photon, that is 1 out of every 4, or 1 out of every 25 photons, on average know it is supposed to be reflected instead of being transmitted? How does it know that? After all photons are identical. The 1 out of 25 reflection is true even for a 1 at a time flux. If you have 1 photon coming through, and then you wait, maybe go and have lunch, send the second photon through, it's still going to be 1 out of 25 that does the trick of bouncing back and being the one that's reflected. How does it know what to do, how to do this? Who tells photons what to do? And similarly, in a 2-slit experiment, and I don't need to talk too much about the details of this because it was covered quite well in Dean's talk, Feynman had this to say about explaining the 2-slit experiment in terms of what happens when single photons impinge on the slits. Electrons, like bullets, strike the target 1 at a time. Yet, like waves, they create an interference pattern. If each electron passes individually through 1 slit, with what does it interfere? Although each electron arrives at the target at a single place in time, it seems that each has passed through or somehow felt the presence of both slits at once. So how does this happen? In the book by Hawking and Mlodinow called The Grand Design, they talk about this. And I'm going to read this. It's a bit long, but it's worth hearing this explanation of things to kind of judge what amount of sense it makes in terms of explaining reality in a way that is consistent with current physicalistic materialist science. Feynman realized one does not have to interpret that to mean that particles take no path as they travel between source and screen. It could mean instead that particles take every possible path connecting these points. The situation at both slits matters because, rather than following a single definite path, particles take every path and they take them all simultaneously. That sounds like science fiction, but it isn't. In fact, in my opinion, it is, but they say it isn't. In the double-slit experiment, Feynman's ideas mean that particles take paths that thread through the first slit, back out through the second slit, and then through the first again. Paths that visit the restaurant that serves that great curried shrimp, and then circle Jupiter a few times before heading home. Even paths that go across the universe and back. This, in Feynman's view, explains how the particle acquires information about which slits are open. Now, if there's anything crazier than that, I don't know what it would be. If we came up with some theory of something that mainstream science found to be ludicrous, and our explanation were at this level, we would be very sharply criticized. In fact, we'd be laughed out of the room. But this is, in fact, the explanation that Feynman offers, and that is conventional physics. For both the 4% reflection and the single photon double slit experiment, hardwiring the physics is seemingly impossible. I wouldn't know how to hardwire something to make the photons know that it's their turn to do this versus that, or to create an interference pattern or not to. But a software algorithm would have no problem generating this behavior. I mean, it's really simple to write a little bit of software to have these phenomena happen. So the duality conundrum that we face is this. If matter and energy is the fundamental stuff how does consciousness arise? On the other hand, if consciousness is the fundamental stuff, and it is non-physical, how did the physical universe arise from consciousness? So this is the question we have to answer when we think about the situation we're in today in terms of trying to understand consciousness. But let's pursue the idea that everything is consciousness. Everything. That's really all there is consciousness. This would be called monism, or specifically idealism. The modern twist on this is to view consciousness as a digital simulator. Brian Whitworth wrote about this. He said, one of the mysteries of our world is how every photon of light, every electron and quark, and indeed every point of space itself, seems to just, quote, know what to do at each moment. The mystery is that these tiniest parts of the universe have no mechanisms or structures by which to make such decisions. Yet if the world is a virtual reality, this problem disappears. So again, it's very easy to make up a law of physics that's run by a computer that follows a few simple principles that you program into it, and voila, you can explain these things. But try to hardwire this behavior into nature, I don't know how to do it. And if you do try to do it, you come up with something like as crazy as Feynman's ideas on the photon following every possible path through the entire universe before it decides to come and hit the screen and manifest a pattern that shows that it's aware of the other fluid it didn't go through. How can space, time, and the Big Bang be caused when there is no space or time for causation? How can there be quantum fluctuations when no quantum laws exist? Well, these are questions that are very serious questions in science. But you could say that the startup of the simulation provides a very natural explanation. Why is there a maximum speed? The speed of light. Well, this may reflect a maximum processing rate. Why are things quantized? Well, it's natural for a digitally computed reality to be quantized. That's what it's based on, is digitization. How are non-local instantaneously transmitted effects possible for entangled particles? Well, in the view of this being a virtual reality, separations are calculated. They're not real. There are no true separations. So if the virtual world that is the universe says that this photon, which is entangled with the other one, is separated by 10 light years, they are both separated by 10 light years from each other, how can they possibly interact because they're entangled? Well, it's because the simulation is being run somewhere where that distance has no meaning. The distance is simply something that's computed. Why are the basic laws mathematically simple? Well, again, virtual reality-based laws must be easily calculable. Why are fundamental particles of a kind perfectly identical? Well, each is created by the same digital calculation. Why are there discrete state transitions in quantum mechanics? Again, this is natural for a digital simulation. And so the proposal I'm making is that there really is only one thing in reality that explains everything that we know of and things that we don't know of yet. And that is consciousness. And the consciousness creates a virtual reality with laws that govern it, and then enters into it to experience what it's like to live in that kind of universe. And the people experiencing that are us. The people in this room are experiencing what it's like to live in this consciously created virtual reality. And I think this explanation, though it sounds crazy at the moment, in fact, it would have sounded really incomprehensible even 50 years ago, is a way to look at things that might take us in a wholly new direction. I mean, but even as recently as 1960, if we went back to that era, you wouldn't understand what I meant by virtual reality. But now, you can go down to the store and you can buy games that just show what kind of complicated and complex virtual reality we can create ourselves. So I think this is a way of looking at things that has a future. Here's an example of a virtual reality. This is a shutdown of the virtual reality holodeck on board the Starship Enterprise in the year 2365. And you can see that the reality shows that the fading out of the virtual world and going back from the stadium to the holodeck of the USS Enterprise. So is the universe of vast conscious created virtual reality? I think it may well be. And I think I will end it there.
Thank you very much. We have ample time for questions.
I'm not sure there's a meaningful distinction between a technological virtual reality and a consciousness-created virtual reality, but I find myself wondering what's your reaction to the problem that the simulation hypothesis, in whichever variant, is is too powerful and therefore irrefutable. I mean, absolutely anything can be explained by, well, those are the parameters of the simulation.
All right, well, first of all, I think there's a huge difference between the simulation created by programming some kind of computer that in the far future is complex enough, has the capacity to generate many orders of magnitude more data than we have now, versus what I'm suggesting, which is that there is no mechanical or pseudo-mechanical computer. There is consciousness, and somehow some great consciousness is able to do computations. Maybe within its own mind, it can generate hundreds of billions of particles, the representation of these particles, to make up a universe and keep track of these things for billions of years. It's the substrate that holds the computation, or does the computation, would be consciousness, and the thoughts that this consciousness puts into it would be the data that is worked with. And so it's a very different kind of explanation for what the origin of the consciousness or the simulation is. And as to the other question, which was, do you recall now?
Problem of
refutability. There actually may be, because if this quantization is correct, then there are certain things that might be observable, such as the maximum possible energy of a cosmic ray. We're detecting cosmic rays that are about at the limit of. There's a phenomenon called the GKZ limit of cosmic rays, and I can't go into that right now because I'm not an expert in that, but this is something that was cited in one of these papers as being a possible test for the discretization at extreme energies of reality. So there could be some tests to this, and I agree with you that it's probably not something that's going to be taken seriously unless we come up with some real tests that can be done. And maybe this GKZ limit observation is one that, is the first step in that direction.
In this model where reality is created by consciousness, where I imagine you're speaking specifically about human consciousness, so where do non-human animal consciousnesses come into play, especially animals that existed on this planet before humans?
Yeah. Well, what I envision is some great consciousness, some universal consciousness. And some people like to call that God. I would, but I don't think you have to. Just view this as a consciousness that's beyond anything we can understand, but that has the ability, if it wants to do computations. Sort of a digital reality, create a super simulation, because if it does so, then it can enter into that virtual world and experience what it's like to live in that world. It can be both a thing of recreation or a thing of evolution. Maybe this consciousness evolves itself by creating worlds in which it enters as individual beings, not just as people, but animals, aliens, somewhere else, and experiences what it's like to become ethical in that kind of world, or be unethical, or to be good or bad, and that would be the purpose of it. So this is what I see as the great difference between a virtual reality that's created on some supercomputer in the future versus one that's created by consciousness itself, which makes universes, ours being one. And it's kind of interesting that it was said 1,500 years ago by St. Augustine that the universe, in his view, was something that is not something that's fixed forever. It's something that's constantly held, quote, in the mind of God. And if God were to look away for one moment, the universe would disappear. Kind of interesting thing that to be said from such a long time past. And St. Augustine had, I think, a good point that is surprisingly relevant today.
We're
Yes.
over.
I'd just like to mention that I've seen a very interesting suggestion that the terms God, light, truth, and reality are synonymous terms. It just kind of depends on one's psychological upbringing and cultural group, which one might be chosen. But it's difficult to deny all four of those terms.
Yeah. Good.
Are you familiar with Max Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis? And if so, where would that fit or maybe not fit into your concepts here?
I've heard about it. I've not read it, so I really can't comment on it. But I think it's probably he's talking about the purely physicalist, mechanical interpretation of computation. Nothing like consciousness that I'm discussing here, right?
He
It's
says
nothing
his
but
theory
math.
is the universe is nothing but math.
Well, okay, I guess you could recast that semantically to mean about the same thing that I'm saying, because the point here is that I don't want to envision some kind of a creator that goes boom, 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 makes things happen, you know, like pulling rabbits out of a hat. Rather, we were learning that the digital computation can create for us something like a virtual reality that is extremely powerful. And so maybe this consciousness, you know, creates within itself the ability to be like a computer and to create digital worlds. So in terms of that being a mathematical universe, I guess you could call it that.
Yes, if consciousness is being created by a computer simulation, or consciousness is creating the universe that we experience, do we understand what consciousness is, though, and how it can be created?
I don't think you can understand it other than to know it. I mean, this is the one thing we all know in this room. You know, we are conscious, and I don't think that trying to explain it in terms of anything simpler is going to get us anywhere. We know exactly what consciousness is because we're living it, and we're thinking. We are conscious. Don't ask for anything more than that. You've got the basic experience of it right there in front of you.
Thank you very much, Bernie.
Thank you.